Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I'm Shane Mauss. Today, I'm talking with Melanie Martin, and we're going to be talking a lot about favorite topic on the show, and we haven't talked about it in a minute, childhood development stuff, something that's super interesting to me, even though I'm not a parent, never planned to be a parent, and I still just cannot get enough of this subject matter, and I know listeners like it as well, so you're in for a treat. Hello, Melanie. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks.
I wanted to... I'm a little flustered. I screwed up our time. I'm running late. And then for some reason, I keep on calling you by the wrong name, which my listeners are used to, by the way. I do it with every guest, so don't take it personally. But your name is truly Melanie and not whatever else I was saying before in the 5 times that we
Millennial? I think millennial.
Did I say millennial? That would be a great,
Close.
a great name for somebody.
I'm proudly Gen X, definitely not millennial. So.
Tell the audience a bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so I am an anthropologist, more specifically in the field of what we call biological anthropology. I am currently an assistant professor at the University of Washington, Seattle. So living in Seattle, Washington, I did my PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And my PhD work, I worked with an indigenous population in the Bolivian Amazon, the Tsimane, and I worked with mothers and infants studying how they fed their infants, how they decided to change feeding at different stages of infant development, and how that affected the infant's health and mothers when they started resuming ovulation. And I have since been working with a population in an indigenous population as well in northern Argentina, the Qom, again on topics broadly related to growth and development, feeding, as well as birth practices, but have not since COVID been in the field. I am also a mother myself. I've got an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old. And so like many parents, I'm just grappling even more so with work-life balance and COVID and all the ways that we're impacted by that. I currently have a quarantined 4-year-old, and this is my little break of time. Anyway.
Well, thank you for finding some time. What have you been working on since COVID?
So started off just kind of working with data that we had previously collected, like scores of old data, and doing secondary analysis. I've also been involved with a group. We mobilized pretty quickly early on in the endemic when it wasn't known if the virus could be transmitted through breast milk specifically. So working with collaborators at Washington State University, University of Idaho, and Tulane University, we began to recruit mothers so it was earlier variants of the virus, the first variant, who had been
fond
infected.
Memories.
Yes, such different times. Who had been infected and were breastfeeding to provide breast milk samples and also blood samples of themselves and their infants, so we could look for evidence of the virus in milk, also antibodies in milk, and then antibody responses in the infants. So that has kept me busy these last couple of years.
Interesting. Do you have any findings about that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so we've had one paper come out recently, just this month actually, and we observed in our study participants what has fortunately also been replicated in other observational studies that there's very little evidence of the virus transmitted in breast milk. There were some studies early on that were showing it. And what we actually found in our study is that we found some cases in which, because we had asked mothers to swab their breasts before taking the breast milk sample. So we had them swab the breast before and then after cleaning it. And we did find some moms we found some RNA on those skin swabs before cleaning, but not after. So one thing we think is where there have been some isolated reports of viral RNA in breast milk, it's probably related to contamination. It's not in the milk itself. And other studies that did also isolate RNA, viral RNA in milk, have found that the RNA doesn't replicate. So it's just like fragments of the virus. And then we have also observed, as other studies have, that mothers who are infected then have a really robust antibodies in their milk that persist. We had mothers providing samples that we measured for 2 months out post-infection. So breast milk, not risky for transmitting the virus, probably beneficial in terms of providing antibodies.
Interesting. And what does providing antibodies, what does that mean in terms of long-term health? Does that mean I know with other diseases, some very early exposure early on can help train immune systems in individuals. Is that the hope? Is that some of that is happening naturally?
Yeah. So because it's getting delivered through milk and it's going into the GI tract, right? It's really providing passive immunity as a type of barrier function. So, it's able to bind virus in the GI tract and is probably pretty transient. There is maybe, I'm not a total expert on this, but there is maybe there's some thought that maybe in saliva, like actually when milk is in the mouth, that could be more of an important entraining mechanism there. But it wouldn't be, as far as I know, there's not a mechanism that once antibodies are in the gut, that they're, crossing the gut barrier in any way, getting into circulation and training the immune system in that way. There was one study that looked at infant salivary IgA for infants that were born to mothers who had been infected. So, they were infected, the moms were infected just before birth or in the hospital, and with COVID, I'm talking about COVID specifically. And I think only one of those infants then tested for COVID via a PCR test in the neonatal period. And then 2 months out, though, the breastfeeding infants, they'd had detectable SARS-CoV-2 specific IgA in their saliva, whereas there were some formula-fed infants in that group did not. And so that was the researcher's suggestion there, that there had been some stimulation through breast milk of IgA, but that it was likely specific to salivary IgA.
That's so interesting. It's amazing what an incredible filtration system breasts are. I can't believe it. I've heard this kind of talked about by past guests, and it's just incredible that we evolved such that even in the face of novel pathogens and things that we didn't evolve with and for, that breast can still filter out modern threats that potentially our ancestors. I'm not saying this as clearly as I would like to. Anyway, what's the take that? What's your take on breastfeeding in terms of the duration, in terms of your studies that you've observed in the past? Because it seems to me that our ancestors usually breastfed for like up to 3 years with a child. And so I tend to be like, yes, you can't beat a mother's breast milk. You should breastfeed for 3 years. I'm not a mom. That's super easy for me to say, like, hey, moms, go out there and breastfeed your children. What has your research with hunter-gatherer communities found in terms of what works well?
Yeah. So, we're humans, we're mammals, and like lactation is the defining, right? That is the defining trait of all mammals. So certainly ancestrally, all humans would have breastfed, and all human offspring would have been breastfed for some time. My work is not with hunter-gatherers, but I, work with the two populations that I work with. One is a subsistence scale population. So they do provide most of their own food and sustenance through some hunting and fishing, but also just mostly local horticulture, small scale agriculture. And the other is a peri-urban population. But their breastfeeding practices are what we pretty much envision ancestral practices to be. And that is, everybody is breastfeeding. They're breastfed from birth, and they're breastfed what we call on demand, in that infants are really rarely separated from their mothers. They're carried around all the time. In the Tsimane, they carry around in slings all the time. And very different from kind of styles of breastfeeding in the US, where, in fact, women are told by nurses, and if you look up online, like, how often should I be nursing, they'll be told, for 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes on each breast, like every hour or every 2 hours or something. They're nursing in short bursts for like maybe a minute, a couple times an hour. They're just kind of constantly nursing. They also sleep with their moms throughout the night, so they're nursing 24 hours. And then they'll be slowly given different liquids and solids, and they'll continue nursing for, with the populations I work with, 2 to 2.5 years on average, some a little bit longer, some shorter. We know from archaeological evidence, right, because you can look at stable isotopes in bones and tell when a child was still nursing or not, or when they were completely weaned. Around 3 years is pretty average. Certainly when we look at populations in which everybody breastfeeds, there's a lot more variation in terms of like the total, weaning ages, where you have some kids who nurse for long periods of time, up to maybe 4, 5, 6 years. But on average, it's closer to 2 or 3. And the big predictor of when kids are weaned in those type of environments is when the mother gets pregnant again, for the most case. Like there's not so much tandem feeding, certainly in the populations that I work with and what I know of the ethnographic record, it becomes pretty taboo to nurse a child when there's a new offspring on the way. And there's could be specific taboos around that. So, so with the Tsimane, for example, mothers will say when they know that they're pregnant, if they were nursing, they'll start weaning. And so you can end up with usually where you see that there are kids who are nursing up into their 4th or 5th year, they're usually to older moms who are like at the end of their baby making years, and they just aren't getting pregnant again, so they can continue to nurse.
I see. So what about the idea of nursing itself kind of signaling to shut down some of the ovulatory processes? Yeah.
So that's called lactational amenorrhea, and it's
lactational amenorrhea.
Lactational amenorrhea.
Okay.
Yes. So it's something it's hormonal, and also the energetic cost of nursing will suppress ovulation. So what we see typically in the U.S., right, or in populations like the U.S., so among mothers who are exclusively breastfeeding, they will not be ovulating, not be menstruating on average for about 6 months. In populations like the population I work with, the Tsimane, it's closer to 14 months. And that has been documented in other kind of subsistence scale populations and populations where they're really nursing on demand. And it's in part because of the frequency of breastfeeding. They're really, it's that constant upregulation of lactation. And also, though, that it's what we call the relative metabolic load of nursing. So how much producing milk is costing you in terms of calories. So if you are a mother that is nursing all the time and also out walking around, foraging, being very active, right? That's a bigger metabolic cost on you compared to someone like me, that even if I am trying to stay active and nursing all the time, like I can just go to Starbucks and drink a big, grande latte with whipped cream. And I have just offset all of that calorie loss in an instant. So we see that moms in the US have shorter durations of lactational amenorrhea, even if they're pretty intensively nursing, because it's not so metabolically demanding on them.
Do you have, this doesn't sound like it's necessarily your research specifically, but I'm sure you have thoughts on it. What about formula? I'm someone that I'm a big believer in what science is capable of and could happen eventually. And at the same time, it just seems like things like whipping up some baby formula meant to replicate the lactation process that's been shaped over such a long evolutionary time, that's adapting to various pathogen threats and delivering antibodies and all these really, really intricate, specific, context-dependent things. It seems like formula just wouldn't stack up to that process. I try to catch myself from falling into a kind of naturalistic fallacy or whatever, but do you have thoughts on the formula versus natural milk?
Well, for the reason that lactation in mammals has evolved over 270 million years, and in our own hominid lineage for a couple million years, right? There's never going to be a perfect replacement in terms of nutritional composition, other bioactives, any type of hormonal signaling, anything like that. The formula is not human milk. But what I view formula as is I classify formula in my research, it is something that it can be added in addition to breast milk, right? It's a non-maternal milk substance. And humans are pretty unique compared to other primates in that we have a lot more flexible feeding in how we feed our infants. It's really a defining feature of human evolution that human infants, relative to other great apes, wean earlier, meaning they're completely off of milk, but they're still dependent on their mothers and other caregivers like fathers, grandmothers, other kin for feeding. Whereas primates, all other mammals, once they wean, they're out independently foraging. They have an infant stage and then a juvenile stage. And what marks that is full weaning. So not to say that there's not a process in which they're learning to forage during that, but by the time they're done, they are completely in charge of their own feeding, which is not the case. And that, in part, what enabled that kind of flexible evolution in humans was, one, that we are able to process foods and get a really high quality processed foods because of tools, because of hunting, all these ways. So we're able to give infants and young children high quality foods that feeds their brain growth and development, and offset the loss of milk. So what I have argued that really that type of mixed feeding is really what defines us.
Interesting.
And so in a modern context, formula can be part of that. The issue maybe for how it works with breastfeeding today, because we don't live in an environment in which it's really conducive to carting your kid around and nursing them on demand all the time, is that at some point, formula feeding in a bottle can offset so much how an infant is going to be nursing that milk production would start to slow down and it comes to substitute milk. But I think it's all really context dependent. Are you giving an infant a bottle of formula here and there because you need to do other things, and we have other caretakers, and they can take care of the baby for a while? Or is formula really being used as a substitute for breast milk early on, to the point that weaning would happen much, much earlier than we are likely biologically evolved for? I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with formula in terms of things that you could give to infants. It is actually, it's going to be better than giving them like almond milk or something, because it has all these added vitamins and has been composed to best mimic the composition of human milk. So in terms of substituting, is the best thing we have. But you can also just look at it as there's all kinds of ways that we would have been feeding infants from pretty early on too. From like 3 months on, we would have started, in what we see in many populations, they are starting to give infants other things like liquids and traditional porridges and all kinds of things that on one hand, they're even just stimulating all kinds of other physiological aspects of how infants begin to process foods and digest foods. It's stimulating, maturation of the GI tract and the gut microbiota and all these things. So it can be on that spectrum as well, not just formula versus breast milk.
That's interesting. So baby food has been around humans for a very, very long time before it started being in the little Gerber jars or whatever.
Yes.
Interesting. So what does that generally look like in the people that you study? You said porridges and things?
So, well, for the Tsimane, one of the most common things they give as a supplement, like if moms are reporting problems nursing, if they report that they're not producing as much milk as they think they should be, they will give their babies what's called chicha, which is made mostly from yucca, from manioc, like boiled down yucca. And then, it's boiled, it's mixed with water. You can get different consistencies. So it's more like mashed potato, more like broth. And you can also let it ferment and become alcoholic. That's not usually what they're giving to the babies. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, with the Tsimane, so some type of chicha is very common throughout South America. There's, different variations. If it's like corn-based or manioc-based. And it is traditional in many populations that you chew it up. You chew up the manioc or you chew up the corn as part of the processing. I don't know exactly why. I imagine because it's like breaking down the enzymes to break down starches probably helps. But like in higher altitude populations, they will do that as part of the chicha making process, but then boil it. And the Tsimane don't. And it's only women who can do it. And so you take some boiled manioc, you put it in your mouth and you kind of let it sit there and shoot up and then you spit it out. And you do this over and over. You like have this big pot of manioc and then that sits there. And the longer it sits there, it'll get more alcoholic. But otherwise, you just take it and then you strain it, you mix it with water, and that's what you call sweet chicha, and that's what's typically given to infants. And then what the Tsimane eat is also like they eat a lot of stews. So they'll give those to infants. And I've actually studied pre-mastication in the Tsimane because I just got really interested in the topic. I'm interested in infant microbial development. And so we were really curious if that is having an effect on infants' microbial development, because presumably they're getting, more inoculated with all of the microbes through chicha and anything that the moms pre-masticate. And it is not what I thought. Like when I actually sat down and started interviewing moms and observing it, I was thinking of pre-mastication as like, well, this must have been what moms did before we had tools like you were chewing it up, like really processing the food and then giving that to babies. And that might have been part of our evolutionary history. But what Tsimane moms are mostly doing is they'll take like a spoonful of food and they'll just kind of put it in their mouth. And they're mostly making sure it doesn't have any like gristly meat particles or bones, because they'll have fish stews that, you just throw a whole fish in. And they're making sure it's not too hot. So they're really making sure it's safe for their infants to eat, more so than they are like processing it. But I had moms like do it and spit in a cup, and you can see that it is definitely like the end product of that little 5-minute thing is more watery. And there's definitely bacterial transfer, but it doesn't seem like it has any lasting effect, at least that we could tell in our research, on infant salivary microbiomes. And that infant salivary microbiomes are totally different from adult salivary microbiomes. And one infant doesn't necessarily have that baby's salivary microbiome is not going to be more like their mothers than any other adults, even though their mothers are, they're getting this kind of exposure. Yeah. And it's probably, what we think is that there's just so many other things that are affecting your microbiome when you're a baby. Like you don't have teeth. There's all sorts of development that hasn't happened. So it's just a completely different ecosystem. And it's still very transitory. So even if you're getting fed, it's a transitory thing. And then if that bacteria has really nothing to stick to, it's just going to go through.
Oh, I wouldn't have guessed that. So just to make sure that I'm understanding what you said. So some of those, what you would expect is some of the early exposure that's coming specifically from one individual mother is not exactly transferring as specifically to the child.
Well, we were able to test and observe what we would have expected, and what we were looking for is that infants should be more similar to their moms than another mom, right? So like if I'm a baby, my salivary microbiome should have a composition that looks more like my mother's than any other random woman. And we didn't see that.
That's weird. That's interesting. Huh. Okay. And you're saying a possible explanation for that is that some of those processes just aren't happening at that stage of development, or there's just so many other factors in the environment that are influencing?
I think part of it is just that it's too transitory, like the exposure that you get. And so there have been studies in adults too, where they look at, the salivary microbial composition before and after kissing, or like between couples. You would presume that couples would be more alike than random people, and they don't see that either. So that's one suggestion. It's just too transitory. You swap spit for a minute and then, it just washes through.
Okay. You don't become like the Highlander or something and get all the powers from anyone that you kiss. Okay.
Yeah. And then
it's all downside. That's it. You maybe get sick from someone. You don't get their immunity.
Right.
That's a raw deal. Huh. That's really interesting. That seems a little counterintuitive, right? Like it's not what you would expect to find necessarily.
I mean, I think, the issue is that what really shapes our microbiomes are there's constant exposures like diseases and food. So when you can look at, say, a household, and there's maybe more, there might be more in common among household members because of just a shared environment, but that's because of like constant everyday exposures.
Mm-hmm.
We're eating all the same things, we're exposed to the same air, we have the same water, right? Not necessarily that I'm around my kids and hugging and kissing them all the time.
Do you think some of the immune system, I don't know enough about how the immune system works, but do you think some of it is when you talk about the transitory nature of things? So I am terrible at names, just the worst. You've already experienced this. It takes me, everyone thinks they're bad at remembering names, and everyone remembers faces better, of course. But I meet so many people, or at least in my old life of touring as a comedian, meet so many people that it's like, am I going to actually see this person ever again in my life? And, it would kind of take a few interactions before my brain would be like, okay, this is going to be a reoccurring thing. And this is now memory that's kind of worth storing because it's been pinged enough times, or you take to learning some new concept and you don't quite get it the first time, and your retention increases on that second and third time that you learn the same thing kind of phrased in a new way in a different textbook or what have you. Do you think that the immune system is sort of learning in some situations in a similar way?
Meaning
like meaning it's exposed to all sorts of things, figuring out what to build defenses for. It's building defenses for future environmental threats, and one of the criteria that it's using is like, how often has this threat popped up in the environment?
Well, there is there is an idea that it's outdated to say that the immune system is self versus non-self, but how the immune system recognizes what is something potentially harmful or not can be entrained through more regular exposure early on. Not so much how we learn to recognize pathogens, but at least what the immune system recognizes as sort of everyday things you're going to encounter, but not in, say, like, I don't think it's like a predictive way, but more so that it's costly for your immune system to mount like this big defense, right? And so if your immune system is saying, well, okay, I'm going to run into these bacteria all the time, these parasites all the time, I essentially learn to live with them. And that's something that different parasites can co-opt to their own benefit as well. Like a lot of longer lived helminths have that. So our bodies produce this, sort of more innocuous, more regulated response to them. And there's one idea, this is basically the basis of what's called the hygiene hypothesis, or the old friends hypothesis.
Oh, I love the hygiene hypothesis. Please go into it. Yeah.
Yeah. So one idea of why we experience so many autoimmune disorders and inflammatory disorders and allergic and atopic disorders is that our bodies didn't get this calibration early on, because instead of being exposed to a lot of environmental microbes all the time, right? Along with things like in infancy, like maternal milk and, just all kinds of microbes in your food and water, we're basically exposed to a bunch of plastic and cleaning agents and stuff more than anything.
Yeah.
That are where we've lost this ability for the body to regulate between what is harmful and what is not, and it responds with these very robust responses to things that aren't pathogens.
Can I share the way that I understand the hygiene hypothesis, and then maybe you kind of clear up I like doing this. I present the way that I think about things. It's always wrong in about a zillion ways, and then you get to correct me, and that's how I learn. So my way of thinking about the hygiene hypothesis is you have this immune system that and various behavioral cues and things that, you know, there was no amount of scrubbing that our ancestors 100,000 years ago could do to rid their environment of various bacterial threats, and so we have this immune system prepared for just using an arbitrary number, say 10 threats a day through all of human history. This is kind of what would happen. And then suddenly something like Lysol and modern sanitation comes along. And now those threats, again, just a made up arbitrary number, go from 10 to 1 a day. And there's some sort of kind of almost like a supervisorial type of mechanism being like, hey, why are we only registering 1/10 of the threats that we would expect to register, not knowing that our immune system can't see that we're living in city life now or something. Mm-hmm. And because of that, then kind of upregulating the sensitivity of threat detection until then there's like, oh, dander, maybe that's a threat, and then sets off the immune system, and that immune response is then kind of becomes the threat in and of itself. That allergic response is the more of the harm than the false alarm that set it off in the first place.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't know where the current thinking or evidence is here, but that whether, is the prototype a kind of more like inflammation is the baseline, and then exposures early on start to tamp that down to a more regulatory response. Mm-hmm. And so when you don't have the exposure, you're just at this inflammatory baseline. Like we're predisposed to blow out fires everywhere. Or is it that in the absence of any exposures, or not in the absence of any exposures, but with limited exposures, it gets set at a higher level of kind of threat detection. I don't know. I mean, there is for women, there is a lot more evidence that autoimmune disorders in women are related to the fact that women, as compared to men, on average, we do have a more pro-inflammatory baseline. But that's part of the trade-off that occurred over time with reproduction, and that as our reproductive biology evolved with, much earlier than happens today, pregnancy and more or less constant periods of gestation and lactation in a lifetime, right? Those are things that are setting the immune system down, right? You have to suppress the immune system to tolerate a fetus.
When you're pregnant, this foreign invader inside of you don't want your immune system attacking it.
Right. So the idea there, yes, is that women have this higher pro-inflammatory baseline. And now, in the absence of pregnancy, like very delayed pregnancy, very few pregnancies for many women today, right? There's no counterbalancing of the suppressed immunity, and that is why autoimmune disorders in women are so much more common than in men.
I would think that females just generally would have a heightened, would have potentially ancestrally have potentially higher costs to getting some various diseases and stuff as well. I don't know. To me, it always just feels like evolutionarily males are usually just kind of like spaghetti thrown against the wall and like whatever sticks, I guess that works out. Whereas like evolution has taken a lot more caution with females and a lot more species, and then and even in terms of males, like the classic example of the peacock feather showing off not just the ridiculous amount of weight that it can overcome unnecessarily, but the absence of parasitic load that is potentially advertising as well. It's just fascinating because it's a lot of there's a lot of females in infectious disease research, I believe, right? And I wonder if that. I think it is more a higher percentage than males, and I wonder if there's
I didn't know that.
There's some sort of phenotypic thing going on there, because I mean you don't see a female version of the show Jackass. You don't see ladies tipping each other over in porta potties and stuff like that. And so that's just interesting to hear that then. Perhaps that upregulated immune defense is then in certain instances leading to more allergies in modern females when allergies.
Well, it's more autoimmune disorders.
Oh, more autoimmune disorders.
Yeah. So these more kind of inflammatory related immune disorders.
Do those? Sorry, I'll let you.
No, go ahead. But I was just going to add. I mean. But you're right. I mean, testosterone is immunosuppressive,
right?
And so we have different males and females in most species, humans too, right? There are different mating strategies. Most of the costs of reproduction are borne by females, even in humans, in which we are distinguished by actually a relatively high amount of paternal investment in offspring. Males still invest a lot more energy, both their kind of where their biological energetic trade-offs are happening, and then the going out and doing stupid stuff in competition, for broadly writ.
So I'm always a little bit skittish about taking guys' advice in situations of global pandemics, because I know that I had a tweet in like April or May of 2020 that I feel like still rings a little true to me, which is if you give a male a situation in which biceps will not help in any way, and you'll see them flexing the hardest that they ever have. And so anyway, I don't want to get distracted from your work, just stuff that's on my mind. But have you noticed in the cultures that you have researched, have you noticed differences in autoimmune disorders?
Well, so with the Tsimane, this is the population of Bolivian Amazon, where again they're living in a very high pathogen environment. There's most villages, until very recently, most of them did not have electricity. The ones that do still have very limited kind of sporadic. You can maybe put a light bulb up in your house. There's not plumbing. Everyone's getting water from the river, maybe a well. But there's no, protected water sources or clean water sources. And they're growing most of their own food and hunting and fishing. They build their own environments. And so they have been the project that I worked with, the Tsimane Health and Life History Project, which is co-directed by Michael Gervin and Hillary Kaplan, has been working there for 20 years, and they've observed in multiple dimensions, right? You just do not see a lot of chronic disease in that population in terms of coronary heart disease, very low levels of obesity, and other metabolic disorders, things like that. And like allergy and autoimmune disorders, they're just absent, or relatively absent as far as we know. You just don't see those kind of diseases of modern environments there. But there is still at the same time a lot of gastrointestinal respiratory illnesses, infectious diseases. Infant mortality can be very high. So it's not like an Eden. There's
right. Yeah, there's trade-offs.
And in terms of the other population that I work with, the Qom, is a completely different economic ecosystem there. Their situation, the Qom were traditionally part of a huge indigenous population that spanned the entire Chaco region, which is a region of northern Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil, I believe, that, over the course of the last 200 years, because of colonization and very patriarchal and racist practices, they have been, reduced. Numbers have been wiped out. Their concentrations have, they've been concentrated in certain areas, and they don't have, in Argentina, they don't have the numbers and the political autonomy that other indigenous populations in South America do. And so where the population that I work with in this one particular community, it was a community set up by the government that they build homes and electricity and provide them with that. But with some basic services, but there's not a lot of economic opportunity. They're dependent on government welfare. And so there you see, like in many rural impoverished populations, there's very high rates of obesity and metabolic disorders, along with battling other types of infectious diseases too, because it is a more impoverished environment, like tuberculosis. So they've got a lot of dual burdens of disease there.
What's that mean, dual burdens of disease?
Dual burdens is, it can be like the combination of overnutrition and undernutrition, for example, in which you've got people they're not getting the micronutrients that they need from food, but they're getting all like the kind of, the excess of macronutrients of fat and sugar. So,
I see.
And it can be the dual burden of chronic disease and communicable, non-communicable, communicable and communicable diseases. So whereas we, like in the US, with the exception of COVID, there's very little burden of communicable infectious disease. It's all, it's cardiovascular diseases and cancers and things like that. And, up until recently around the world, there had kind of always been that divide. It's like part of our epidemiological transition. You're either still in all the burdens are infectious disease that mostly infect early life mortality, versus all your burdens are these non-communicable diseases that mostly affect later life mortality, right?
Yeah.
But we increasingly see in more economically marginalized populations and lower middle income countries that they've got both. Because
gosh, yeah. That wow. Well, that sounds like there's a lot of lessons to be learned from populations like that. Both directions, what we can learn about indigenous cultures that still have more autonomy and what we can learn from the impact of modern living at the same time. I want to stay down that train of thought just a little bit, but can I jump back just because I love the hygiene hypothesis. I got so excited when I first learned about it. And then like everything, there's a little more, there's some competing hypotheses and more complexity. And, because people would have autoimmune things, be like, well, what you need, you haven't exposed yourself to enough threats. So what you need to do is go to India and walk barefoot in the latrines and get a bunch of parasites and stuff, and that will recalibrate your immune system and get rid of some of these autoimmune issues. But one of the competing, before people go running off and doing that, there's also a competing idea that maybe it's not just some lack of having sterilized everything and eliminated a lot of these threats. Maybe it's that our immune system is also just confused by the amount of, like you mentioned, plastics and things early on. So we're just throwing all of these modern things that our immune system is like. How does an immune system be like plastic? What the heck is that? It didn't,
Right.
It was never exposed to such a thing in the environment that it was built in. Nothing even remotely like it. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because there's a common thing going on right now that I hear, that obviously there's trade-offs between actual infectious disease and autoimmune stuff that happen, and sometimes you can get it both ways. But there's this tendency, I think, now to be like, well, actually, if you go out and get yourself COVID, it's helping you. It's helping your immune system, because your immune system needs constant training. And I think that's a dangerous thing for people to think. And at the same time, I've been super COVID cautious, and really hunkered down. I'm hunkered down again. And last year was the first allergies I've pretty much ever experienced in my life, where I went from, before COVID, I was touring 3 cities a week. I was often in airplanes. I was getting, like, looking back at it, it seems insane. I was getting 5-6 colds a year, and I haven't had a single cold since COVID started, but I've had some allergies and things start popping up. So I don't know. Do you have any, I know this isn't exactly your research, but do you, just bouncing that off of you?
No, I mean, it's not my area of research. I mean, I can at least say from my knowledge of some aspects, like if you take autoimmune disorders in women, for example, it's very well known that women who suffer, say, from rheumatoid arthritis and then get pregnant, their symptoms go away during pregnancy. So it's not just the plastics for things like that, right? There is something about how our immune systems themselves are calibrated to kind of certain conditions. And I think there's enough evidence for, like when you look at laboratory studies where they've done fecal transplants with mice and things like that, that you can immediately manipulate the phenotype by manipulating microbial exposures. So, how that exactly works out to developing the immune system is still, I think, an ongoing area of research. But that's not to say at the same time myself, like, I'm very worried about plastics and pesticides and all these other things in the environment that, especially in early life, as you're being exposed to any kind of novel food or environment, like, they are present too. So how do you know what the immune system is picking up on? Is it the peanuts, or like, but I mean, definitely peanuts have different antigen properties, but like, is it microplastics in our food along with whatever, I don't know.
All right. That's a point for the hygiene hypothesis in my mind. I think, I don't know. I think it's something that it's really interesting to think about. I think that there is something going on with it. I'm going to bounce around one more time before I get back to the main point of your research. Just because you mentioned the fermenting and the alcohol, I had heard about in the past, the idea of potentially alcohol having evolved as you have this porridge, and then it sits around and they reuse it sometimes and rehydrate it, and it leads to fermenting over time. That seems like the idea of chewing up food to turn into baby foods to deliver to your baby, that feels very intuitive to me. I can get how our ancestors stumbled on that, but going and picking up a old bowl of porridge and then making the discovery, oh, you can get a buzz off of this now sour fermented stuff. Like, what was going on there, do you think? Just desperate? You ever find yourself thinking about that? I mean,
no,
obviously, this is wild speculation. This isn't something that you could study.
There's observations in the wild of animals just eating,
fruits
fermented fruit that's fallen. Yeah. So I think it's a pretty common happy accident that can occur. And then, humans were pretty quickly able to be like, we could just do this on purpose. We just leave it there for a while and do it on purpose.
yeah, that's funny. Are they? How much of is that like a treat to have some alcohol, or is it saved during festivities in your, or is it something that where there's a range that you would see in cities where some people are having a couple drinks every day, some people are wild alcoholics, others never touch the stuff at all. How regular is that consumed? Again, I'm sorry that I know this isn't really your specific research, but you live around these people, so
right. So I spent like collectively over a year of my life there, and while I was there, which was between the years 2009, 2013, it was mostly a once a week thing, like where for like per family, maybe they might do it once a week, but it could, if you're walking around visiting people all the time, you'll hear like, oh, they've got chicha, and meaning the chicha posh, it was like alcoholic chicha. Definitely when there was festivities, like maybe each village would have their sort of founding party once a year, and everybody would go there, and people would prepare for that by making a lot of strong chicha ahead of time so everybody can have that. But it was, I think mostly kind of once a week, more not so like, and even when you do, there are individuals who drink more than others, but they're usually trying to go into town and get bottles of alcohol. And that's where, when you see people who drink more than others, is kind of related to the other alcohol that they can get, not, oh, I got to make sure I always have some strong chicha on hand.
Right. Interesting.
Plus, it's mostly men who are drinking it, and are totally dependent on the women to make it. So, yes, women have some control.
Oh, that's funny. So going back to child rearing, there must be, as you're kind of talking about some of these kind of getting hit from both directions, it seems like some of the what is it, the ones in Argentina, what's their names again?
The Qom.
So the Qom have more of this mix of like they're more integrated with modern city life, right? So what does their child rearing look? Is it like a hodgepodge of various kind of ancestral things with, like, do they have strollers and stuff like that they use? What's that mix look like?
Well, they're so depending on the community, they might have kind of more traditional kind of cultural practice in place, but sort of the expressions of culture that I, as a non-Qom person, I can easily see and observe, like, oh, they're making a traditional basket here, like kids aren't necessarily a part of that. I think what is still very traditional is just their kind of kin structure and day-to-day life, in that, you're around your family all the time. There's not rigid divisions of, family time and work time and separation in that sense. Everybody's commingling. Kids especially are really kind of left on their own. They're, out playing in mixed age groups. They're being sort of collectively cared for. Once you hit the age of 3, 4, you're like an independent person and you're off on your own. And that is how human childhood evolved, with not a lot of direct oversight from adults. There are schools in the community, and relative to the Tsimane, where there are schools in villages too, but not every village has a school. And when schooling is really, really sporadic, and not as, I don't want to say not as important, different families place different value on it, but because they are still so dependent on subsistence living, right? It's really equally important for families and kids that they're learning these other cultural practices. With the Qom, education is sort of more valued and recognized as a necessity. Unfortunately, though, compared to other, the non-Qom within the region, like they're not getting as many resources. They don't have as many avenues, graduating after post-graduation to put that education to use. And they experience a lot of direct racism as well for even people who do want to do that. So there's a kind of tension there where they're, I think, trapped by what modern life is expecting of them and they expect of themselves. But and how they still live and experience, like how central family is and the idea of autonomy from an early age is.
How much is child rearing? How communal is child rearing in the groups that you research?
I think this is something that I think we really fail to understand in our society, especially when you talk about what attachment parenting is and stuff. So, right, attachment parenting came from the idea of attachment parenting came from observations of I forget which group particularly it was, but from the book The Continuum Concept, right, where it was a Brazilian indigenous group, a psychologist who was down working with them, from observing mothers and infants. And that is a very intensive relationship, just like I observe with Tsimane families and Qom families, where infants are never separated from their mothers. There's no need to be. And mothers' lives integrate that care into them. So even though they are continuing to participate in other aspects of domestic life and household labor and production, right, it's in a way that you can still do it with a baby. And our human society kind of evolved around that with cooperative care and paternal care and investment, in terms of both who's going out and procuring food and everybody in the household, like different generations contributing within a household, different numbers of kids, a lot of older siblings taking care of younger siblings, things like that. And we see that. I feel like many American families have embraced that idea of intensive parenting that is true for infants. But once they are 3 years old, they are off and doing their own thing completely. And in fact, giving a lot back to their family. They're breasted with a lot of autonomy, independence, and responsibility as well. And we, on the other hand, have this continued idea of intensive parenting from infancy through, age 25 or whatever, that parents are still providing all of this direct care and really demanding care to their children for a very, very long period of time. And it's something that's recent. I mean, I said I'm a Gen X person, and I remember my own childhood and grew up with a single mom. And, I remember from a very early age, like mostly, like riding my bike around the neighborhood and being off and just like, see your mom, go to my friends, things like that. It's not that far away, but something more recently in our society flipped a switch, and we've lost that idea of childhood as being a really important time of autonomous development. And, it's safer though when there's a lot of eyes around you, and we don't have that structure now.
So what do you think of if you were to be kind of given your own island, and not through like making not through your tyrannical rule of law, but just guiding people. You have a new island full of people, and you want to take some of the best qualities of modern living and our ancestral past and various traditions and combining them. What would you do? Because there's a lot of our ancestors didn't need to worry about some of the problems that come along with sedentary lifestyle that impact many today. We don't need to worry about infant mortality and anywhere near the way. There's some amazing modern. You can get a robotic arm if you lose an arm. Right. That's certainly something that our ancestors didn't have the opportunity for. What kind of what do you think that each culture could learn from one another?
Yeah, I think about this all the time, because I had started researching breastfeeding and infant growth and development long before I had any intention of being a mother. And it was mostly because I was just interested in how the environment gets distilled into a person, and that point of how lactation reflects a mother's environment, I found really fascinating. And then, I got pregnant, my husband was in the field with me, and while I was doing my dissertation, and so was pregnant, talking to moms who have just a very different experience of motherhood than any U.S. mother is ever going to have, and very different experiences of birth and nursing. And so that being around them then instantly sort of influenced how my ideals of how I thought I could parent and would want to parent. And, and then I left Bolivia and immediately am back in the US, faced with the actual constraints of what our environment is and how impossible it is to do some things, even though, I intellectually have my understanding of, what I think we evolved to do, and is, for probably better for our emotional and psychological health and development overall. And I'm just constantly confronting it. And yeah, there's not, they don't easily translate. You can't easily adopt the practices of one culture in a completely different culture when it's not easy to, I mentioned it's not easy to nurse on demand when you don't have the freedom to do so. And when you have all of these other pressures that would take you away from a baby, even if you commit yourself to fully doing that. I would say that because I, just recently done some work where we were looking at from Qom mothers that we had previously worked with, looking at their breastfeeding outcomes, and had interviewed moms about how they also kind of struggled with breastfeeding early on. And it just became really apparent to me through talking to them and in that research, just how important for women, just the time and freedom is when after you give birth to just the expectation is that you're just resting and not doing anything and other people are there to help you. And we don't have that at all. Even among families that are fortunate enough to say, if their mother's working and has maternity leave, if the mother isn't working, she may not live in an environment that she's got her family around her. And you're just kind of expected to get up and go. We have this completely flipped perspective of what pregnancy, what vulnerability is, or, what healing is and recovery is for pregnancy and postpartum, that I think normally exists in these populations that I'm working with and throughout most of our ancestral history, and that women were doing most things, up until they give birth. They're not a protected class while they're pregnant, but as soon as they do give birth, they're spending weeks and months just resting, taking care of their baby, like getting help, breastfeeding. They're recovering and they're providing for their infants pretty intensively in that moment. And we have completely flipped that, where pregnant women are this
walk it off,
very fragile, special group of people. Yeah. And then as soon as you give birth, if you have a cesarean section, it's not understood, which it is, to be major surgery, and you're just expected to get up and move on with your life and get out and then immediately lose that baby weight and all these things. So that is totally effed up in our society. And we have the means to fix it, at least through policy. I mean, the other major thing, is now as my kids get older and I think about how kids have grown, how childhood evolved, I do think what I would really import is more play and mixed age group learning and less structured childhoods. Absolutely. And I recognize that, for many parents and families, the idea of that is risky and terrifying, because a lot of kids are bullied, we have different, my kids aren't, I'm not Black. My kids aren't Black. I don't have to worry about those threats for them. It's not a perfect translation, because where kids can be protected and learn and be free, culture is the learning environment. Cultures are much more stringent. So where you have, and I'm just trying to say, right, I think it's easier to just learn from your environment in a small society where culture is much more rigid. So you can kind of leave kids to learn on their own, because they are at every opportunity learning from other people and surrounded by other people. But it's very different than if I just say, tell my kids, just go outside and learn what you will, because we have compartmentalized everything in our society. We don't have a rigid culture, right? We have a million microcosms of culture across our population. And they need more kind of direct instruction. But if we could come to a happy medium where there's at least a lot more time for play and learning through play and experimentation and just their own peer interactions, I would import that.
That's fantastic. That's a great answer. And it would actually be a perfect place to end. But I have one last question, just because maybe I have future scientists listening, or just people that are curious about what life is like as an anthropologist doing what you do. One of my favorite books is Robert Sapolsky's A Primate's Memoir.
Oh, yeah. That's a great book.
Yeah. And how have you enjoyed your work as traveling and getting to do some of the living with the people that you've talked about? Do you recommend it, or?
I do. It's not, I know it's not for everybody. I mean, it's what drew me to being an anthropologist in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was just fascinated by how other people live. And that's not, many people aren't. And I think that's an important lesson for our culture. The more we do understand how other people live, and that our own beliefs are very much determined by the environments that we grow up in, should give us some more empathy and understanding for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the weirdness of being in a foreign culture, and I love finding moments of kind of true understanding and connection. I think for me as an anthropologist, it actually one of the most rewarding times for me as an anthropologist was after I had kids. And when my youngest son was a year old and I was down in Argentina in the community, it was so easy to converse and interact with the mothers I was talking to, because we had an instant bond that really did cross over everything else. And it was very different from anything that I had experienced previously. It was, and I don't know, other dimensions where you can so easily just sit down and talk to somebody and identify with them because of just shared experiences of being a mother. Fatherhood wouldn't necessarily do that, because the experiences of fathers is so culturally different across, like that is just a kind of fact across humans.
Mm-hmm.
That was really rewarding. And I think I don't know what advice I would give to anybody there, but if you enjoy, certainly if you enjoy not just immersing yourself in other cultures, but really be putting yourself in a situation where you are going to be the odd person out in order to learn from them. Anthropology is usually not the most popular of majors, but that's what we endeavor to do. We endeavor to understand what is universal across humans, and then why different populations are distinct, and why people within different populations are distinct.
Sounds fascinating. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Melanie Martin. You're a terrific guest, and best of luck with all of your own child rearing. And do you have plans to go back?
Yeah, I am. I'm definitely hoping to go back to Argentina this summer. We continue to monitor the situation. I have work with Qom Villages is the co-director of the program I direct, and Sofia Olmedo is our field coordinator. And Sofia is Formoseña. She lives in Formosa and has been giving us regular updates throughout the pandemic about what has been going on with the community. So we are privy to the challenges that they've been experiencing.
Such as, I got to get you out of here. I know you need to go in a minute, but if you can, is there anything that you want to say about what some of those? I'm curious what they're experiencing, being such a different culture.
So what has been the hardest for them, because Argentina took a very proactive stance against the virus early on, and there was very little community circulation early on, but their proactive stance in the province, bordered on kind of violating rights, and they have just been kind of shut out of a lot of areas of life that things that have happened here, like the loss of education and learning, has just really exacerbated issues that are going on in this community, especially among youth, in relation to alcohol and drug abuse and, growing violence, and loss of years of education. And it's challenging for the community because children are completely autonomous. And so that tension between there's not the overarching culture that is kind of keeping people in the same line, and there's not a lot of strict parental oversight, but these outside influences that are promoting just a lot of alcohol abuse and violence, and not going to school. So it's a hard time for the community right now with not a lot of answers. So certainly that we can provide, and not a lot of resources or attention given to them in the province from the Argentinian government.
Oh, wow. Well, I wish them well. I wish you well. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful guest. And I wish we could have talked for longer. I was running late today. But thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. And we'll see you more next week.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you.